Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out and braving the weather tonight. I know it's not ideal weather, but thank you for coming out. So tonight, I'm Chris McGoldrick. I'm the Director of Planning and Economic Development, for those that don't know. So tonight, this is put on with the newly reorganized Affordable Housing Trust. They've been working on the efforts to develop an action plan which will guide the Trust's mission and goals for the next number of years. We've held a number of stakeholder meetings at a more personal level, and tonight is a culmination of that community engagement as a community forum. So really looking for that input on what the Trust will be doing in the future. We'll begin drafting the action plan with all of that community input after this meeting, and everyone will be involved in that process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our consultant, Jen Goldson, who's one of the housing gurus in the state, and she's been working very diligently on this project so far. I'll leave it with her.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. How's everybody doing? You didn't get wet trying to come in here? You beat the rain? All right, good. So I'm Jen Goldson, community planner. My colleague Elena is here as well. And tonight we're gonna give you a relatively medium-sized presentation. I'm not gonna call it short, but we tried to keep it, not too long. But we are going to go through just a little bit overview about what this project is all about. We're going to talk just a little bit about Shrewsbury's housing needs. And then we'll talk about trust basics, just so folks know what's eligible, what can a trust do. There are definitely some limitations to what a trust can do. And then we're going to talk about these boards that are up behind us here, and that's how you can contribute when we're done with the presentation. So the purpose of doing an action plan for Shrewsbury's Affordable Housing Trust is to really help them get organized about what priorities should we focus on in the next 5 years. There's a lot of things that a trust can do, and oftentimes the trusts that we work with, maybe that have been up and running for a while, struggle a little bit because they're not quite sure where to start or how to run their program, and there's so many different options that it's really smart of the town of Shrewsbury and the Shrewsbury Affordable Housing Trust to go through this kind of process, to be really deliberate about making some choices. How do we want to allocate our funds? How much other funding might we want to go after in the next 5 years to support those priorities? And so that's what this plan will help them do. And the plan will include a mission statement and goals, which are in draft form on these boards, and I'm going to go over them in the presentation as well. We'd like to get your feedback on what they say at this moment. Then we'll be creating specific actions for short-term, medium-term, and long-term, if you want to call 5 years long-term, but we'll split it up into, what do you want to do year 1? How about years 2 and 3? How about years 4 and 5? So they'll really will have an action plan. The trust will know even from month to month, what should we be doing? There will be a 1-year detailed action plan, which does break down their first year month by month, so they'll know exactly what to focus on. And then we'll have a 5-year estimated budget. How much money will they need to support these ideas? And then they can, of course, seek that funding because they won't have all of it in their bank account right this moment. So that's what that plan will include. We looked at your most recent housing production plan to get a sense of what Shrewsbury's housing needs are. So we really liked this quote, so we pulled it out of your housing production plan. It says, Shrewsbury's worked for years to provide decent, affordable housing for low and moderate income residents who cannot afford to buy or rent market rate units. Though Shrewsbury has been fairly affordable compared with its wealthier neighbors, home prices in Shrewsbury have increased dramatically. And so I suspect you'd all agree with that statement. Okay, I'm seeing some nodding heads. The photos we have here are some of your existing housing, some newer, and one of the Housing Authority developments as well, just to give you a sense of some of the stock that you already have. Some indicators that the housing production plan pointed out is that there is a growing senior population, so that indicates a certain type of housing choice that you'll want to look at, including smaller options, supportive housing even, accessible housing. Then looking at rising housing costs, really outpacing the incomes. So incomes have risen too, but not as fast as housing costs. And that's something that's not unique to Shrewsbury. There's also been a loss of that older kind of starter home housing stock, maybe the smaller homes, good entry level housing, with redevelopment, tear downs, that kind of thing. And then you have, raise your hand if you're already familiar with the subsidized housing inventory. This is the state's list of affordable housing. And the state has a goal that every community in the whole state has at least 10% of your year-round housing stock as affordable and counted on something called the subsidized housing inventory. Sometimes you'll hear that called the SHI or the SHI. A lot of people on the Cape call it the SHI list. But that just means it's a list of all the housing in your town that counts toward that 10% goal. Shrewsbury's at 6.4%, so you have a ways to go. You need just over 500 more units to reach that 10%. Now, I have this little footnote here. This number 70 is important. So where did I get that number? When you do a housing production plan, which you have, one of the benefits of that is if you meet a minimum production goal in 1 year, you can get something called safe harbor, meaning your zoning board can actually deny or impose additional conditions on comprehensive permits. If you're not at that 10%, you have much less control over those types of comprehensive permits. So the state allows this incremental production. You may not be able to get to 500 units right away, but maybe you could get to 70 in 1 year. That's the minimum goal. So I put that number there because you'll see that we incorporated it into one of the goals that we're looking at for the trust. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. But I just want to ask, does what I've explained, I just really touched on this, so please feel free to let me know. Does what I just explained make sense? Do you have any questions for me? I'm happy to explain this in a little bit more depth before I move on to housing trust basics. Okay. All right. And you can also feel welcome to come up to me or Elena or Chris or Louise after this meeting if you want to ask more about this. We're happy to provide more information. All right. So what is a housing trust? A housing trust at its very basic is just a place to put money. It's a place to put money that's designated for affordable housing. It's run by a board of trustees, who a lot of you are here today. So if you could raise your hand if you are on the trust, you sit on the board of trustees. Thank you for being here. And that board has the authority to decide what to do with that funding. It also can own property and sell property, so it's different than other municipal boards. It has more authority. And you might wonder, where can it get this funding? So it can get the funding from lots of different sources. The ones that are starred on the screen are showing you where, two of them are where the trust has already gotten funds from, and the third one is where a potential source could be in the future. So you've already gotten trusts from inclusionary zoning payments. That's just as part of your zoning bylaw. Developers, when they build a certain number of units, need to either create some affordable housing as part of their development, or they need to give some money to the trust. There may be other options there. I'm simplifying this. But that's where some of that funding has come from. Other funding has come from developer settlement. You can also negotiate developers' payments, so I put those kind of together. And those are typically one-time payments. You can't really count on those. The inclusionary zoning is similar. You don't quite know how much you're going to get from year to year. It all depends on what's happening in the market, what projects are approved, what might trigger that payment. But there's another source that's newer to Shrewsbury, the Community Preservation Act. So I do not believe, somebody correct me if I ever misstate anything, just correct me. I'd rather be correct than save face. I do not believe the trust has received Community Preservation Act funds yet, but that is a very likely source. Most of the trusts we work with are in CPA communities, Community Preservation Act communities, and that is one of the primary funding sources where trusts get their funding from. The good thing about CPA is it could turn into an annual request, and it could even be pretty predictable. So that gives you, or could give you, a very nice steady stream of funding that you know you have that budget to work with every year. Now, it's certainly not up to the trust whether it gets that funds. The trust can only ask for the funds. The Community Preservation Committee would need to recommend that the funds be allocated, and then town meeting actually decides that every year. Is anybody here on the Community Preservation Committee? Okay. I know we spoke with at least one committee member in the roundtables that Chris had mentioned we had done. So we have some of their perspective, but that's, I think, going to be a very important source of funding for the trust in the future. Any questions on, I glossed over the other ones. Are there any questions on these other ideas, or any questions at all on this slide? Okay. All right. So this is just a breakdown of the funding sources that the Shrewsbury Housing Trust has received funds from. I just mentioned this on the last slide, but here you can see some of those details. So you can see that in Shrewsbury, the CPA, Community Preservation Act, will make just about $1 million annually. It'll fluctuate depending on what the state provides and your local growth and whatnot, but it's roughly speaking about $1 million a year. And so 10% of that fund, the CPA fund, Community Preservation Act fund, is required to be either spent or set aside for housing. So 10% of $1 million is 100,000. So that's something we can think about. Well, maybe that 100,000 goes to the trust every year. Maybe it doesn't, but I'm just throwing it out right now. All right, so what can you do with trust funds? You can do, basically it's a bricks and mortar kind of list here. You can create housing and you can preserve housing, and I'll explain what that means. So creating housing does not mean that the trust is gonna get out to a site and get their hammers and build housing. The trust, however, can own property that they offer to a developer through a procurement process that meets state laws, select a developer to then build the housing. The trust can either hang on to that property, which is rare, or it can transfer that property to the developer, or a mission-based nonprofit is an example of a developer. Some people have already started talking about Habitat for Humanity as a mission-based developer. So that's an example of what you can do. So you can have property, you can look for a developer. You can also, I'm not going in the order here, so let me get back to the order of this list. So the first one here, you could provide financial support rather than the land, like I just gave you an example of. You can actually give from the trust funds, provide funding for a development that's creating lower moderate income households, lower moderate income housing. Now that can be to a private developer or even a nonprofit developer. You can also rehab existing homes in order to convert them to affordable. There are a few different examples of that. You can also create something that's not a home into housing. So some communities have used schools to create housing. Others have gone and found, modest single-family homes to create affordable units out of them. So there's lots of different ideas in this second one. Rehab existing homes doesn't just have to be homes. You can also you can negotiate increasing the level of affordability in a private development, and you negotiate that again with your funding. You can develop, if there's any surplus municipal land or buildings, that's something else. Those could be transferred to the trust, and the trust could issue a request for proposals to find a developer to develop those surplus land or buildings. You can also preserve properties faced with affordability restrictions. And I did look back at your housing production plan, and we did a little research on a site called CDEC, which I'm happy to share with Chris. I just did this today. I found out the information, so you don't even know yet. But you do have 2 properties that are listed as expiring, but it looks like both of them are relatively secure, and we can go into the details of why that is. So preserving properties that facing expiring affordability restrictions is probably not something you need to do here, at least not yet. And then the last one, if you have CPA funds, Community Preservation Act funds, you can also create a rental voucher program. Lots of communities around the state have done that. So those are just some examples. One thing that's not explicitly on here, but it would go along with rehabilitating existing homes to convert to affordable housing, is a home buyer type program. You can create a home buyer program that maybe some nonprofit runs, or another entity that's qualified could run that kind of program for you. Same thing with a rental voucher program, and you could do some kind of home buyer program that can help with rehab of existing homes. You could improve them, bring them up to code, that kind of thing. Health and safety improvements. Does this list, any questions on this list of examples or types of things trusts can do? So I want to just give you some real life examples of what trusts have done in other communities that fit within these different ideas that I just listed on the last slide. So the one on the, I guess your upper left, is in Andover. They created a new home for home ownership. They used trust funds to do that. There's one in Carlisle where they created a multi-family senior housing development. Here's another one, a Habitat for Humanity, that was done in Sudbury. That was a duplex that they created with trust funds. I think in this instance, the trust actually acquired, do people know what tax title lands are, or tax foreclosed properties? It's if a property owner doesn't pay their taxes for a certain amount of time, the town can decide to take that property for the back taxes. That's one way trusts have been able to get property. If it's developable property, or if there's a building on that tax title property that could be reused and converted to affordable housing. And that's what Sudbury did. And they offered that land to Habitat for Humanity through a competitive RFP process. Other ideas, the town of Eastham on the Cape, they ran this program for a long time where they would use trust funds to buy property. They were single-family homes, two-family homes, and I think condos. And they would hold on to them. Before, you might remember me saying, most trusts don't hold on to their property. Well, Eastham did hold on to the property. And they contracted with a regional nonprofit to run a rental program. They would verify incomes, they would manage the properties, and they ended up owning these properties all over Eastham that they bought, and they rented out. Now, of course, there's carrying costs, there's ongoing costs associated with this idea. There's certainly pros and cons to holding on to the property. Happy to talk more about that if people have questions. But it's not a typical route trusts take. They typically release those properties to another entity to hold. Another idea, Norfolk still runs this, where they convert, they also buy property, but this is for home ownership rather than rental, and they rehab the property, bring it up to code, health and safety, and then they sell it with a deed restriction. They have a ready buyer list, and they run a lottery to put that in a certain order. And every year they do this with a few units. So that's another idea. Okay, and this one I'll just skip over. This is an example of preserving expiring restrictions. All right. Any questions on those examples before I move on to what we're doing tonight with the mission and goals? Okay. So the trust is certainly bound by statute to create or preserve low or moderate income housing. But beyond that, as long as you fall within that statutory requirement, your mission can be more specific. And your mission can even change over time, depending on your housing needs, depending on your housing goals, where you're on the subsidized housing inventory, for example. At some point, you will surpass 10% on the subsidized housing inventory. And then perhaps you take another look at the trust mission, and maybe their mission changes at that point. So a mission can be static or change over time. And really what we want to try to get at that mission is, what is the mission's real purpose for existing? What is our wish for this trust over the next, if we think of this mission to guide them for the next 5 years, how would we know they were successful? What would they have to have done? And so we did draft up a mission. We've been working with the Board of Trustees, as well as with a variety of you folks and others at these roundtables that we were having over the past 5 weeks or so. And we came up with this mission that the roundtable folks might recall that they've seen this exact mission. We actually haven't changed it yet. We're really just kind of collecting ideas right now. But the ideas here is that the mission could be threefold. So one, you can see on the top statement, it says to increase inclusivity of the community. And then the three ways of doing that is one, by ensuring existing affordable units are preserved. Two, supporting affordable housing development, including both rental and ownership units, to help the town incrementally reach that 10% state goal. And then the third, as part of what we've drafted, and you can, we're certainly going to look at changing this if that's what the community members want. The third is promoting community understanding about affordable housing and the housing needs of Shrewsbury. So those were three directions that the trust felt was appropriate given where Shrewsbury is right now in its housing needs, in its level of community understanding, in its percentage on the subsidized housing inventory, etc. And so we're going to ask you, you can certainly ask me questions, but what we want you to do is give us your feedback if you'd like to see this changed, something added to it, rewritten in any way. We have a board in the back, it's in the middle of the room, where you can take a Post-it note and write down how you think it should be changed. Or if you really like it the way it is, that's good to know too. You can write on the Post-it note, I like it just the way it is. So that's our first question for you. And then we have another board back there, right next to the mission board, that talks about some draft goals. So what do I mean by goals? So goals aren't something you can actually do. It's not an action. It's a condition you're aiming for, and they're often measurable. So they may have a unit count associated with them, like we want to create X number of units over the next 5 years. Or it might say, we want to help X number of households with their housing needs over the next number of, 5 years. It could also be more general, and you'll see the goals that we've written for you to comment on. But this is really what's going to be driving the actions that we come up with for the next 5 years. Does it make sense so far? Okay. So here are the draft goals. They're also written on that board. We have a choice between 1A and 1B, although after talking with the folks at the round table, we think they could be not necessarily a choice, but you could do both. You could look at opportunities. The first one is really about focusing on increasing the number of units that count on your subsidized housing inventory. And that would indicate a different kind of a strategy than the second goal. The second goal is more about prioritizing funds for the most vulnerable members of your community. And we listed some very specific incomes here, but basically it's extremely low or very low income households. Help them stay in Shrewsbury, help them afford to live in Shrewsbury. And so those indicate two different approaches. You can do both. As I said before, there could be some kind of hybrid. Some of it really depends on opportunities before you. You do want to be opportunistic as well. But the first one would indicate probably larger projects for the most, less funding per unit of the trust fund, because these larger projects have lots of other federal and state funds that go into them, and the trust would be one of many sources. The second idea, 1B, is more about deeply affordable, vulnerable populations. You're probably looking at smaller projects, but 100% of the units are affordable. And maybe there are even service-enriched units where services are provided. It's a different kind of framework. Not to say, again, you could do both, but we just wanted you to be really thoughtful about what direction you want to go in. Then the second and third ones on this list are more about, the second one is about if we use our funds, we want to try to get deed restrictions that will last in perpetuity, as long as the law will permit. And then the third one is let's prioritize helping housing needs for housing needs that are documented. For example, through our housing production plan, we know what Shrewsbury's housing needs are. You'll update that at some point, but really looking toward those documented needs. And so what your documented needs include right now are senior housing, housing for disabled households, and first-time homebuyers, among other things, but those are just examples. So we'd love to know if you have other ideas. We'd really love to know, do you like 1A, 1B? Do you want some kind of combination of them? If you have any other ideas that you want to see on this list, that's what that goals board back there is for. You can take your Post-it note and give us your ideas, or you can say, I really like 2 and 3, and, I want to focus on 1B, or whatever it is you want to say. Any questions so far? Okay. So how you can contribute tonight, we have some information boards. Back where Elena is standing, there's a board on just more information about the Housing Trust, about this process, where we are in the process. There's a timeline. We also have a QR code there, and that leads to the Housing Trust Guidebook, which was done by Massachusetts Housing Partnership. And that's a really good resource. If you want to learn more about housing trusts, you can grab that QR code. The next board is more about housing needs in Shrewsbury. We talk a little bit more about the subsidized housing inventory and your documented housing needs on that board. And then again, the ones I already mentioned, the mission statement, what do you think of it? The goals, what do you think? What else do you want to see? And then we have one last board that's just a catch-all. Is there anything else you want to tell us that didn't seem like it fit any of the other boards? So any other direction you want to give us, or anything else you want to tell us? So that's really everything that I wanted to present, but I'm really happy to take questions if anyone has questions, or you want me to go back over any of the information that we went over to date.
The 70 units, if we get to the 70 units in 1 year, then what happens?
So if the
What does that
town
look
permit, and this would not be all on the trust, it'd just be
Yeah,
the
right.
trust would help. So if the town permitted 70 units that count on that subsidized housing inventory, you can certify, it's not called safe harbor, it's called, you can certify your housing production plan with the state. And then the zoning board of appeals, if you get in more comprehensive permits after that, that maybe are not friendly, not local initiative, the zoning board has more authority to deny those than it does before you reach that incremental production.
So the 70 in 1 year will trigger the safe harbor?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep, that's exactly right. The 70 in 1 year is the minimum to trigger that safe harbor for 1 year. Yeah. Okay, great question. Any other questions? All right, good. Well, we will all be here. So as you contribute, please do contribute. You can always grab any one of us to ask other questions, and we appreciate your time tonight. I know it was pouring rain, and we're glad you made it in. Hopefully not too wet. Thank you.